Hi, my name's Dee, your Professor of Woo Woo, and welcome to Sunchild Tarot. And welcome to a very special guest today, Dr. Chris Mitchell, astrology lecturer, member of the board of the APAI and of the Astrology Association of Britain, and author of a new book, England's first astrology book. Now, we'll get to the book in a moment. Chris, first, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, and it's brilliant to be here. And thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. Now, this is what I ask all of my guests to start off with. What's your origin story? How did you get into the astrology?
I was always interested in stars when I was a kid. I remember being about 6 or 7 and my mum taking me out to the garden and pointing out Orion and Cassiopeia and the plough and things like that. And I've always been fascinated ever since I was a little kid by symbols and codes. So I remember finding a book on Egyptian hieroglyphics in the library when I was about 9. And of course, I couldn't take it out because I only had a kid's ticket. But the librarian felt sorry for me. She gave me an adult ticket so I could take this book out. And I was so excited. It made absolutely no sense to me. It was like some heavy academic tome, but it had all these fascinating symbols in. And astrology, of course, it's a language of symbols. And so I was quite excited by all that. And so I kind of dabbled in it and was interested in it for years, but I didn't really take it seriously until I went into a bookshop in Glastonbury in 1998 and picked up a book by Will Parfitt called The New Living Kabbalah. And I thought, oh, it's one of these things I'll probably have on the bookshelf and never read. But I started reading it and it had some practical exercises in. And I started doing them, and that got me into Kabbalah, astrology, tarot, and the way that everything all kind of ties together. And that really kick-started my serious interest in astrology. So rather than just dabbling in it, actually studying it seriously. And I started going to a local astrology school and did their diploma course in astrology. And it's now become a major part of my life.
And now you're, like I say, on the board of the, what's the APAI again? The Association of Professional Astrologers International and the Astrology Association of Britain. So yeah, you're a bigwig, aren't you?
So, I was involved in the AA for quite a long time because once I got interested in astrology, I started going along to a lot of local groups and things. And then there was a conference in 2002 at Swansea University, an AA conference, Astrological Association. So I went along to that, and that was really good. And I felt really nervous. I mean, it was full of all these people whose books were on my shelves, you know, and I was just this rookie. But it was absolutely brilliant. Really, really liked it. And then a year or two later, they had a conference in Bath, which was just down the road from where I lived at the time. So I phoned them up and said, do you want me to help out? You know, just be a volunteer and do some bits and pieces. So that was it. And then the next year they said, do you want to come, do you want to join the board? And it was like, oh, all right. Yeah, thank you.
Superb. Right. So what led you to writing this book? Do you want to explain what the text is about to start off with, and then tell me how you got into Roger of Hereford?
Yeah, about 10 years ago, Bernadette Brady, who's a very well-known astrologer, and also a colleague of mine because she teaches at the University of Wales on the astronomy and astrology, cultural astronomy and astrology course, said to me, I've just come across this dissertation by a guy that wrote it in Cambridge in the 1990s about a guy called Roger of Hereford, who was around in the 12th century. And he seems to have come up with all these new techniques. And you know what? There could be a unique English astrology here that's never been discovered before, where this guy came up with all sorts of techniques. You need to go and read this, get hold of these manuscripts, learn Latin, translate them, and get that stuff out there to astrologers. Because she thinks big, does Bernadette. She's like me, she's fire sign rising, but with a Pisces sun. So I did, you know, and how could I not? So I spent 10 years doing a PhD looking at all these texts. And at the end of it, I produced this dry as dust thesis, which anyone's welcome to download, but it's really, really boring. And I thought, do you know what? I haven't really done what Bernadette asked me to do, which was get it out there to astrologers. So I thought, okay, now I've done all this research, I'm going to write the book on it that's actually not aimed at academics, but aimed at astrologers, and get this stuff out there to astrologers. So that's the story of the text.
So tell us about Roger of Hereford then.
Right, well, Roger of Hereford was a school teacher, and it sounds like something out of Harry Potter, because I start off in the book with the prelude, which is there's a couple of 13-year-old boys having a fist fight in class, and the Teacher walks along, and one of the boys at the back's acting as a lookout, sees the teacher coming, and they all run to their desks and sit down looking all terribly innocent. And the teacher's heard the commotion, of course. He walks in and goes, okay, right, now let's start the lesson, lads. Why is astrology the finest of all the arts? And one of them says, oh, is it because everything can be narrowed down into 7 planets and 12 signs? He's the class SWAT. And Roger says, yeah, that's good. What else though? And the other kid, the one who started the fight, says, yeah, it's because it lets you see into the future, and that gives you power over other people. Now, you might think a teacher at a cathedral school would be quite horrified by that sort of attitude, but he says, no, that's absolutely brilliant. That's exactly what astrology is about. Yeah, bring it on. So this might sound like something out of Harry Potter with people doing Astrology 101, but it's actually a real school that still exists and still teaches kids in the 12th century attached to a cathedral. And the thing that strikes people as really bizarre initially is, well, hang on a minute, I thought the Catholic Church, because England was Catholic then and would be for another 400 years, I thought the Catholic Church had in its catechism that astrology is the work of the devil and you mustn't have anything to do with it. So why on earth would a teacher in a cathedral school in the 12th century be teaching children about astrology? And where did it come from? Well, these were actually texts that came from the Arabic world. So he's teaching them Muslim techniques or techniques from the Islamic world to Christian school children in the 12th century. And it just sounds too bizarre to be true. It sounds like a very bad plot line for a novel, but that was actually happening in the 12th century.
So wouldn't that make him a contemporary of also the Order of the Knights Templar and all of that, or is he slightly after?
It is more or less contemporaneous. I can't remember exactly when the Knights Templar were, but the First Crusade, the First Crusade was in 1099, and Roger was writing about 1170, 1176, something like that, so about 70 years afterwards. But the Crusades were going on at this time. So you might think there's a lot of hostility between the Christian and Islamic world at that time. Why would he be teaching Islamic techniques? But the background story to that is really quite fascinating. It's like, why did the church suddenly think that astrology was really useful and worth teaching to kids? And why did they embrace Arabic science? So that's two very interesting questions that kind of set the context for why he was teaching astrology.
Right, so this is during that period that historians tend to call the Dark Ages, but it sounds quite investigative and intellectually active, the way you describe it. And also if you look at, because if he was writing in 1170, wasn't it 1161 when they started the purge against the Templars, if I've got my dates right? It might have been 12 something, but there was no shortage of intellectual inquiry going on during this period.
Absolutely. This is, I'm 61, and when I was being taught history at primary school, the story went something like this. We were a bunch of barbarians in England who ran around naked, painting ourselves blue until the Romans came along and gave us, civilization and baths and straight roads and what have you. And then it was all wonderful until the Roman Empire suddenly collapsed one day, and then we were plunged into a millennium of darkness until Michelangelo came along 1,000 years later and turned the lights back on. And it's like, well, okay, did nothing happen in this 1,000 years? But it's because we have this really parochial view in the West that it's only stuff that Europeans do that's important. What's going on in the rest of the world? Well, they're just foreigners. Why would we care about that? And that tended to be the attitude that was prevalent in British schools. And to an extent, it still is. I mean, a popular book written quite recently still describes this period between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance as a dark period when not a lot happened. But that's rubbish, really. The first thing is the Roman Empire didn't fall overnight. What happened is by the 4th century, it had become so big, it was a victim of its own success. So the Emperor Diocletian split it into an eastern half and a western half. We were in the western half, and the western half couldn't keep its provinces together. And there were all sorts of incursions from various Germanic tribes. And eventually the Roman Empire declined, and the final Roman Empire was ousted in the 5th century. And that was the end of the Roman Empire in the West. In the East, it carried on for another 1,000 years until Constantinople was sacked in 1453. So that was going on for a long time. Now, in the Roman Empire, you had a lot of astrology going on. It was adopted, it was accepted, it was used on a day-to-day basis. The Emperor Hadrian, who ruled Britain for a year, cast his own charts every year, wrote his own horoscope. It was just day-to-day life in the Roman Empire. But after the Roman Empire became Christian, some of the early Christians were a little bit suspicious of it. I mean, it had pagan origins. They weren't too happy about that. And certainly in the Eastern Empire, the Emperor Justinian started banning schools that were teaching things that he thought were blasphemous, and that included astrology. So a lot of astrologers then went east to Persia, and they found refuge there. And they took all these classical ideas from the Roman Empire with them about astrology, and astrology was being studied in Persia anyway, because they were a lot more sympathetic to it. Now, meanwhile, in the West, it was less of an issue because the Roman Empire was bilingual. Scholars in the Roman Empire spoke Latin and Greek. But by the time the West had become Christianized, we'd kind of lost Greek and it was all Latin. So all these ancient texts on astrology, people weren't doing astrology because they were written in Greek and nobody could speak Greek anymore. So it did kind of fall into disuse in the West, but it was still taking part in the East. And then the Persian Empire got taken over by the Islamic Empire once the armies of Islam arose in the 7th century. And instead of suppressing it, the new rulers thought this stuff's quite useful, particularly the sciences, you know, medicine, engineering, and so on, and astrology and navigation. And they started translating all these texts from Greek and Persian into Arabic. And astrology became, you know, absolutely a day-to-day thing in the Islamic world from the 8th century onwards. And that meant that it went across North Africa and it came into Spain. So by the time you've got people like the Venerable Bede writing in a monastery in northeast England, he's not particularly interested in astrology, but meanwhile in Spain, you've got people doing astrology on a day-to-day basis. And over the next few centuries, these ideas came more into the mainstream in Christian Europe. And it was like, oh, Arabs have got some useful instruments for navigation, and oh, they got some interesting texts on astrology and the stars and so on. And this gradually got incorporated into learning in the Christian world. And they weren't really seen as Islamic. It's like, yeah, well, the Arabs have translated it from the Greeks, so they're not trying to push their religion on us. These are useful texts. And that's what that's the sort of environment that Roger was writing in. And in the 12th century, when he was writing at the end of the 12th century, but from the beginning of the 12th century, there was kind of an explosion because the Crusades were going on. In 1085, Toledo fell to the Christians, and Toledo's near modern-day Madrid. It was a center of Islamic learning. And the king of Castile at the time, instead of getting rid of the Arabs and Jews, which is what normally happened when a Christian king took over a Muslim town, he encouraged them all to stay. And then Christian scholars went to Toledo, they learned Arabic, they came across these texts, translated them. So we had this explosion of astrological texts coming into, all across Europe. And in particular, the ability to calculate charts, because all very well having an astrology textbook, but if you don't know how to draw up a chart, you don't know how to calculate where the planets are, knowing that Mercury in the 3rd house is going to make you a great healer or priest, not a lot of use if you can't work out where Mercury was when you were born. They learned how to do that in the 12th century. So that was Roger had all these texts and he said, this stuff from the Arabic world is absolutely amazing. I've got to teach my kids this, but there's so many of them and it's really complicated. I'm going to put them all together into a single book for my students. And that's what he did. And that's why I've called the book England's first astrology book, because it's the first time anybody had put it together into one simple volume.
So this is a translation of his textbook for his students.
Yes, it is. Yeah. It's got a few chapters initially that just set the context, but then after that, it goes into a word for word translation of his text and an explanation of how it works with some worked examples, so you can try them out yourself. So it's very much a book aimed at astrologers rather than a general lay audience. The first 2 or 3 chapters will make sense to a general lay audience, but the rest of the book is aimed at astrologers who want to try this stuff out for themselves.
So what wonderful new techniques. I mean, is it just a reproduction of a lot of the Arabic material, or is there something new and special and technique-wise in here that we've not seen before?
Yeah, there definitely is, because what Roger did is really confusing the way that medieval manuscripts are laid out. He says, I'm writing this book in 4 parts, simple judgments, intentions, elections, and the method of judging. So they're the 4 parts. And then he really confuses modern people by launching straight into a really boring and very long section, which is a reference work of all the techniques that just come straight from Arabic texts. And he's just copying various Arabic texts verbatim. And it's like, well, this doesn't seem very original. But then you get to the book itself. And medieval authors often did this. Before, they'd have an introduction, and then they'd have a big reference section about something before they went into the main meat of the book. Yeah. So the main meat of his book says, this is how you do horary astrology. He's actually, horary astrology is where somebody comes to an astrologer and says, I'm going on a long journey. Will it be safe? Will it turn out well? Asking a question. The astrologer casts a chart for the time the question's asked and comes up with an answer. So the first book is just a basic horary textbook, but it's the way that he teaches it. Instead of copying it verbatim from the Arab text, he says to his students, look, here are the first principles. It's really simple. Somebody's asking a question. The planet that rules the ascendant of the chart for the time the question's asked and the moon represent that person. They're asking about something. If it's a long journey, that's a 9th house question. So you look at the ruler of the 9th house. If it's about marriage, it's a 7th house question. So you look at the ruler of the 7th. And then you see if these planets are working together, if they got a nice relationship going on. Is one moving towards the other? If they are, great, it's all going to work out. If they're not, we have to start using more complicated techniques. So he's building it layer on layer, just like a modern teacher would. That's fine, but there's nothing new in there. But then the second part of his book is the book of intentions. And this seems really weird because it's most traditional astrologers I've spoken to hadn't heard of intentions at all. Some of them do come from Arabic stuff, but Roger's really focused on this. And it's like, what does the client really want to know? So you might be an astrologer and a client comes to see you and says, will my father recover from his illness? And now that seems a perfectly reasonable horary question about health. But it might be that what the person really wants to know is, when am I going to get my hand on dad's cash? And that's a very different question, but he's not brave enough to tell you that. So Roger says you can find out what the person really wants, and he uses different techniques to do that. And this is the meat of the book, is this book on intentions. And most of those techniques, even though they were Arabic and are in some of the Arabic books, they're new to most astrologers in the West who haven't really come across this before.
So we've talked before about 12th parts, and 12th parts being a way of seeking intentions. And I've heard that seeking intentions in horary. Is it a 12 parts technique that he's put forward, or is there something else?
Says there are, he gives us lots of different methods, and it's overwhelming. And you think, well, come on, which one's right? And he does address this himself. He says we could do this by using 12th parts. That's how he starts off. And a 12th part is where you divide a sign into a mini zodiac. So the sign of Pisces would start with Pisces, then the next 12th would be Aries, the next 12th would be Taurus, and so on, right through the zodiac. And what you do is, when the person's asked the question, you draw up the chart for that moment, and you say, which 12th part is rising? And who's the ruler of that 12th part? And what's that planet doing? That's telling us something about the intention. And that seems fine. And he gives an example of that. And then he says, you can also use novenes, which are 9th parts. That's an Indian technique. And that's similar. Or you can use something that he calls trigenaria, which is actually an ancient Greek technique. But he's not aware of the origins of all of these. So he says, well, you can use 12 parts, or you can use 9th parts, or you can use this thing where each degree means something, or you can use the Lord of the Hour, or you can use so-and-so. And then he's going, now you might be getting a bit overwhelmed at this stage because I've given you all these different techniques. And he kind of likens it to a court of law. If you've got 20 witnesses to an attack and 18 of them say, well, that bloke did it, and another 2 said, no, he wasn't there at the time, you're probably going to go with the majority. And it's a bit like that. How many testimonies are we getting? So if you do all these techniques and 2 of them say, oh, it's about the intention's about a journey, and the other 18 say, well, actually, no, it's about an inheritance, it's probably going to be about an inheritance. So he is aware that all these different ones get really, really confusing. And it's what modern astrologers struggle with today when you're learning astrology. Well, I've got all these things in my chart, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. And how do I tie them together? And how do I actually make a story out of this? Because they're all conflicting. It's the perennial problem, and he addresses that.
How often do you find, and speaking just as an astrologer from your own practice though, that, like you say, it's the finding testimony. I remember when I was talking with Australian astrologer Shu Yap, I think we got talking either on camera or off about the fractal nature of the chart. You can see the chart repeating itself in whether you're looking at the 7 Hellenistic planets, or adding the modern planets in, whether you're looking at signs and houses, 12 parts, asteroids, you can find the same messages are coming out again and again and again. Is the fact that there's a couple of dissenting voices in all these different techniques, if there's a similar message coming out all the time, are those two dissenting voices wrong? Or are they adding like a slant or a flavor to the overall general gist?
Yeah, I think that they're adding a slant or a flavor. That's exactly right. So if it were a question of, which is basically a question about inheritances, the things journey might be, well, yeah, you will get your inheritance, but you know, your father's abroad at the moment, you're going to have to travel over there and blah, blah, blah. But that's not actually the most important part of the answer, but it is a relevant part of the answer.
Yeah, but the answer is the money's coming.
Yes. It's amazing how all these different techniques tell the same story. You know, I can use modern techniques looking at Pluto in my own chart, and it tells me the exact same thing as looking at it from a traditional point of view, using the traditional planets. And in a way, that's not surprising, because I think the universe is a vibrant, living thing. We're just part of that universe. We're not separate from it. And the universe, well, which is us, is talking to us. And there's lots of different ways you can listen to it, but you're going to hear the same message, just in slightly different ways.
Can you give us some definitions, just thinking about what you're saying? Because we've talked about traditional astrology, modern astrology. We've got Hellenistic astrology, which is ancient, but so much growing in popularity now. You've got people doing the Babylonian. How do you define traditional astrology? I mean, is it based on the Arabic? Is it a specifically Western European period of time that documents are being drawn from, even though their ancestors are the old Hellenistic or Babylonian documents? How do you define it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I'm in a Facebook group called Traditional Astrologers, and it's full of people who post there asking about Pluto. And it's like, well, that's not traditional astrology. And of course, the people that are posting this say, yes, it is. I've been doing astrology for 40 years and I've always used Pluto. You know, they think traditional means bog standard, which is a perfectly understandable way of thinking of it. So I think the term's really rather confusing. When I first started studying it, I did Bernadette Brady's medieval astrology course, which does what it says on the tin. It's medieval. We kind of know what medieval means. But then people said, yeah, but it's not just medieval. What about the ancient Greeks? They were doing something similar. Yeah, well, that's a traditional technique as well. What about William Lilly from the Renaissance? That's not medieval. No, but he's using these traditional techniques. So traditional became a coverall that really covers everything from about the 2nd century BCE right up until Renaissance time, well, the 17th century.
Right.
And everything after that is kind of counted as modern astrology. And the stuff before that, the Babylonian stuff, is sort of pre-traditional. So traditional is this big coverall, and it is quite clearly defined, but it's just not a very good term, because, you know, if you say you're a traditional so-and-so, it doesn't mean that you're steeped in some ancient tradition. Most people mean bog standard, and it doesn't really mean that, because most astrologers are modern astrologers. They're not traditional astrologers.
So what was the one thing that you took away from this? I mean, you said that the intentions were a new signifier for you at the time. Would you say that's the biggest treasure that you found that was new in here?
Well, in terms of techniques, yes, because there's some really fascinating techniques in there, and some of them are really bizarre. Like one that I struggled with was, you can find out the intention by seeing the time that the question was asked. Now, just as the week is divided into 7 days, and each day is named after a planet, so we have Saturn Day is named after Saturn, Monday is named after the moon, and so on. And in England, of course, we tend to use Norse gods for our planets,
Yeah.
but Latin-speaking countries or Latin origin, the names of the planets are used for the days, but each hour of the day has a planetary ruler as well.
Yeah.
So, you know, at the moment it's, I don't know what the hour is, but it might be the hour of Mercury or something like that at the moment. I should have
I might be able to tell you. I've got an app on my phone. Which has decided to stop sending me notifications. Oh well. I know that we've just had the hour of the moon not so long ago.
Right, so we're probably in the hour of Saturn now then, I would imagine.
Yes, Chaldean order, isn't it?
Yes, so it's basically, you know, today is Thursday, so Thursday is Jupiter's day. So at sunrise, it was the hour of Jupiter. The following hour was the hour of Mars, and then it was the hour of the sun, then the hour of Venus, then Mercury, then the moon, then Saturn. And this Chaldean order, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, are the order of the speed of the planets. And it's used quite widely in traditional astrology. But Roger's technique says, so if the person should ask you this question in the third part of the hour of the sun, then the question is about conflict. Well, that's fair enough. And the hidden thing is a piece of twisted white wool. And it's like, well, what the hell does that mean? And one of them was in the third part of the hour of Saturn, the hidden thing is a bat's head or a bird of two colors. And you think, what on earth is he going on about? But I asked Ben Dykes, who's a traditional astrologer who's translated a lot of these texts, you know, the Arabic texts and some of the Latin texts. And he said, oh yeah, it's something that's called, I can't remember the term he gave, a prover, I think. And the idea is you come to me and ask me a question about a journey you're going on. And if I can tell you that you've got a mole under your left armpit, well, I shouldn't know that. So if I've told you something about yourself that I shouldn't know, that proves that I'm a really good magician. And that's what it was used to prove. So the hidden bat's head or a bird of two colors might just be a lucky charm that the person's got on them. And it seems really bizarre. Whether anybody's tried this out to see if it works or not in modern times, I don't know. I don't know many people that carry bats' heads around with them these days, but you never know.
No, but there's family crests, aren't there?
Yes.
Because let's face it, if you was going to go and see an astrologer, you probably had some Wonga. So
absolutely.
If you've got Wonga, you've probably got a family crest.
Yep. It could relate to that as well, although you could argue that probably wouldn't be hidden. And I might have cheated by checking out your family crest in advance.
Well, yeah, that's true. Mind you, obviously pre-Google.
There are some strange techniques in there, but the thing that fascinated me most of all was who were his students. He was teaching kids. So I hadn't realized that when I was first doing it. And certainly my initial PhD examiner was very unhappy with the idea that I was claiming that it was children in a real school. He said, no, it's not that sort of school. It's a school as in, you know, the Chartres school or something. It was a group of scholars meeting up over a cup of tea sort of thing. And it was like, no, I've got so much evidence now. This was a real school. The real school still exists. It's still teaching kids. It still claims to have a history going back to Roger's time. They still talk about Roger of Hereford at Hereford Cathedral and have written articles about him. And the kids in that school, we don't know how old they were, but we do know that a few decades later, when Oxford University became a really established thing, undergraduates started at the age of 14. And at some of the universities in France, they started at 30. And you did a 7-year course and you graduated when you were about 21. So yes, these would have been kids. These would have been young teenagers. And he was teaching them astrology. And that seems quite an extraordinary thing because it's quite involved and it's quite complicated.
I think it's superb, the idea of people having the option of growing up learning this at school, because it's one of the many, it hasn't translated so well into the modern age, but there's a specific way of thinking with astrology as there is a specific way of thinking in science or in various other disciplines, and being able to think in all these different ways and not limiting yourself to just one. We need more of that. We really need more of that in the world. Absolutely.
It was a much broader curriculum. The liberal arts included mathematics, philosophy, a certain amount of religion, astronomy, astrology. And of course, the reason that the church needed astrology, because this was the big question, the early church fathers didn't like it because it was a bit pagan, but they couldn't just stop people looking at the sky, because one thing you needed to know from the early days was how to calculate Easter. And because the Gospels say that Christ was crucified on the eve of Passover, which is a Jewish festival, and they have a calendar that involves the moon and the sun, you needed to synchronize cycles of moons and suns, of the moon and the sun. The definition of Easter, the simple definition of Easter, is it's the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. So you need to know when the spring equinox was, you need to know how to calculate full moons, and you need to know how to do that in advance, because if you're a Christian, you need 40 days notice of Easter so you can commemorate Lent. So it was important. So that meant they had to work with planetary cycles. And once, you know, monks and clever scholars start looking at working out how to synchronize moon and sun cycles, they're going to wonder about the other planets as well. You can't really stop them. And that kind of snuck in through the back door. And then the church accepted bits of it. It's like, well, all right, you can use astrology for weather forecasting, but don't try and use it for anything magical. And not only that, because people couldn't work out how to calculate charts, the proper planetary calculation, sun and moon's easy, things like Mars, much, much more difficult. We'd lost knowledge. So there are much bigger heretical fish to fry. There were people doing actual folk magic. Well, that was far more of a concern to the church than somebody that believes in astrology but has no idea how to draw up a chart. They're not a very effective astrologer if they can't do that. So it kind of fell by the wayside. And then later, things like the Arabic instruments like astrolabes, they could be used for navigation. That was really useful, but they could also be used for astrology. And the thing that tickles me typically is that the reason that astrology came into Christian Europe, given the condemnation of the Catholic Church today about astrology, is that it was introduced into Christian Europe by a scholar called Gerbert d'Aurillac, who became Pope in the year 999. So we have a Pope to thank for the fact that we can do astrology in Western Europe these days.
That's a superb fact, isn't it?
Isn't it?
So where can people, the book, I keep waving it up, but I've not actually said, it is called England's First Astrology Book. Where can it be found?
You can get it on Amazon. It's in paperback format for £16.95 in the UK, and it's in Kindle format for £9.99, and it's available on the other Amazon marketplaces as well. I've got a website which is almuten.co.uk, almuten.co.uk, and there's some articles on there. So there's a bit of a background to the book, and you can have a sneak preview of the prelude of the book and things like that on the website.
I'll put those links all below. Now, what's your next book?
A lot of people, when I give talks on medieval astrology, go, well, that's really interesting. Where can we get the book? And it's like, well, I don't think you can, because I learned mine from Bernadette Brady on a course, and the course materials, but no book. So I'm not sure if there is a gap in that market. I've just ordered a couple of books from Luis Rubiero and Helena Avalar, who are brilliant traditional astrologers. And I'm going through those now, because it may well be that their book does the trick and fills that gap, in which case I'll just recommend that book. But I think theirs might be a little bit more geared towards people that already know traditional astrology. And I think the gap in the market might be a book that says, this is teach yourself astrology, but medieval style rather than modern style. I think there might be a gap in the market for that. And if so, that will be my next book.
Now, how do you feel? Because talking about, again, the labels of various fields of astrology, like Hellenistic, traditional, medieval, modern, how do you feel about the synthesizing of techniques that there seems to be a lot of cross-pollination nowadays, which I think is wonderful, because if you know the technique and the context of that technique, then whether you're using it with a technique of the same context or looking at the chart from a different angle, surely that's something that would enhance the interpretation of the chart.
Absolutely, and it's been going on for 2,000 years. I'd say 10 years ago or so, there was definitely a kind of Berlin Wall between traditional astrologers and modern astrologers, and thankfully it's completely broken down now. you get Chris Brennan, who's a Hellenistic astrologer, coming to the AA conference and giving talks on Neptune-Uranus cycles, which I think is just, wonderful. Yeah. And then you've got, modern astrologers who are saying, well, actually, I use all the traditional rulers in my work as well now because they really bring a lot to the party. So I think it's brilliant. And as I say, it's been going on for thousands of years. When the Arabs got hold of all these Greek texts, they didn't fossilize them. They tried them, played around with them, and adapted them. That's why we have different Arabic techniques to Hellenistic techniques, because the mixing and matching. They'll be using, well, we use this Persian technique here and we'll develop it. We'll take Indian techniques of nakshatras and turn those into Arabic lunar mansions. We'll take the Greek techniques of lots and turn those into a much wider range of Arabic parts. So it's a growing dynamic thing. And in fact, Rob Hand, who's I would probably classify him as a traditional astrologer now, but he started off as a modern astrologer, and most astrologers have got his planets in transit book, which is absolutely brilliant. He says you can tell which techniques work and which ones don't, because the ones that haven't changed in 1,000 years, they're fossils. And the ones that have changed, that's because they work and people have been adapting them and tweaking them and using them, which I think is a really good way of summing it up. So yeah, I think it's great that there's this fusion of it. The other thing that I think is wonderful is when I went to my first astrology conference at the age of 42, I think I was the youngest person there. And I thought, there aren't going to be any astrologers in the future. This is a dying art. Now, the scene is completely full of young people coming in doing astrology. And the interesting thing from my perspective is an awful lot of them are coming into this via traditional astrology. They're following people like Chris Brennan, who himself is a young Hellenistic astrologer. Well, maybe not so young now, but he was 15 years ago when he first started doing this. And a lot of them are looking at this, and you tend to think, oh, traditional astrology, it's a bit boring, it's a bit black and white, it's a bit right wing, it's a bit conventional, but actually it's not. You've got a lot of people from the LGBTQ community coming in, doing Hellenistic astrology and challenging some of the stereotypes that are behind that and saying this is how we can use it in a modern setting. Bernadette Brady does that all the time in her medieval course and says, okay, this medieval concept, which sounds quite horrific, you can actually adapt it because this is what it means in modern terms. So people are playing with these techniques and use them, which is fantastic.
Because yes, astrology has always arisen as, well, in a cultural context.
Exactly, yeah.
So when we're talking about people getting beheaded at sea or what have you, because I mean, let's have a look at the fixed stars astrology. You're going to die. Yes. You're going to die by getting your heads chopped off. You're going to die by a boat. The fixed star stuff is really cheerful. Well, it can be translated into more modern. More modern ways of describing it.
I mean, if I could just give two very quick examples, Bernadette Brady summed it up brilliantly when she talks about planets that are in detriment and fall. These are planets that are bad in medieval terms. And she said, okay, medieval astrology is black and white, it's a bit right-wing. She said, imagine being the only person in your village, in your medieval village, with a different religion to everybody else. You're not going to survive very long. You'll be burnt at the stake or driven out of town. That's what a planet fall is like. It dances to a different tune. These days, that's fine. You can be the only pagan in the village, but they'll still let you sell your chutney at the local church fete, and everyone might think it's wacky, but they'll still invite you around for tea and you can still be friends with them, and it doesn't matter. And provided you're prepared to dance to that different tune and not be conventional and not try to force yourself into a straitjacket, those planets will work really well for you. I mean, in one of the talks I did, I looked at Laverne, I can't remember her last name, who was in I've forgotten the name of the series, but she was born in a male body and she's now a woman, and she's a star in, it's not Breaking Bad, is it? I wish I could. Laverne Cox, I can't remember what series she's in. But when she was 12, she tried to commit suicide because she was being bullied at school. She was stuck in the wrong body, nothing worked. And you look at her planets then, and it's like, yep, she was trying to conform to what people expected of her. Now she's not doing that. that's those same planets are really working in her favor, and she's winning all sorts of awards and, you know, become the first trans woman to appear on the cover of Time and that sort of thing. So once you start letting these planets dance to a different tune, it works. You couldn't really do that in medieval times, but you can use those techniques and adapt them to modern ones. And the obsession with death is the other thing, because the first thing a medieval astrologer would do before drawing up a chart for, you know, the new heir to the throne, because it tended to be rich people that got astrologers, not ordinary people, is there's no point in telling the king and queen that their child is going to be a fantastic scholar or warrior or whatever if the kid's going to die in the next couple of weeks, as children often did in medieval times. So looking at length of life was one of them. And when I look at my own chart, it tells me that I'm not going to survive weaning. Well, I'm 61 now, and I am, I can assure you, fully weaned. But I did have to have an emergency operation when I was 2 weeks old, and that's an emergency operation that wouldn't have been available in medieval times. I wouldn't have survived weaning. So you can look at these techniques and say, yeah, you know what, this isn't telling me how long I'm going to live, it's telling how much oil I've got in my lamp. And these days we can top up oil with modern medicine. That wasn't available 1,000 years ago. So that's where these techniques can be adapted to today's world.
I think that's a beautiful place to draw that to a close. Dance to a different tune. What a beautiful sentiment. Is there anything else that you would like to add, Chris, before we say goodbye? Any other projects that you're involved with at the moment?
No, not really. I'm just busy promoting astrology to local groups, which I think is where astrology happens on the ground. So I would definitely encourage anyone that's interested in astrology, don't think that you have to come along to expensive conferences to be able to meet other astrologers and do astrology. There are local groups all over the UK and Ireland. We've got a Facebook group devoted to it that charge, you know, £3 or £4 for a talk and some really good quality talks. Get involved, see what's going on locally. And a lot of them are online on Zoom now. So, you know, it might be live in Exeter, but that doesn't stop you going to an Edinburgh group for a meeting these days. So just get involved, meet other astrologers, get together on social media, go along to local groups, either online or in person, and just get on and do it.
Right. So Chris's book, England's first astrology book. I'll put the link down below for the Amazon link. It's not an affiliate link. I will put ourmutant.co.uk down there for you. And in the meantime, remember those sage words of advice: dance to a different tune. Cheers.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Darren.